Standing in front of the old general store in Simsboro. It was also here in June 1922 that a large white mob gathered seeking revenge, planning on getting revenge for the shooting of two white men by Floyd Gibson in the Simsboro, Mount Pleasant area. So this would have been the staging area for a race war in 1922.
Daniel Kelly did work for a newspaper, but it was not located in Texas. Although he was born in Taylor and grew up in Waco, he had been residing in New York City since he graduated with a degree in engineering from the University of Texas in Austin. His employer in 1922 was the newspaper The Newark Ledger. It is still unclear how a Texas-educated engineer ended up working for a New Jersey newspaper. He was also, at least temporarily, an investigator for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, otherwise known as the NAACP. He was, for all practical purposes, a secret agent. He came to Kirvin for the express purpose and at the bidding of the NAACP. Kelly was the perfect person for the job. He was quickly accepted by the local people in Kirvin, including John King. They welcomed Dan into their homes as a fellow Texan. Founded in 1909, the NAACP was quite adept at investigating lynchings. And this was the first triple live burning in the United States since their founding. Kelly was sent to Kirvin by famed civil rights leader James Weldon Johnson, secretary of the NAACP. Johnson was a multifaceted American figure known for his contributions as a writer, civil rights activist, educator, lawyer, diplomat, and composer. Dan Kelly wrote a letter to Johnson of his plan.
Dear Mr. Johnson, tomorrow or Tuesday I shall go to Kirvin. I have letters of introduction promised me to the county officials there. I am inclined to believe that the evidence will cast grave doubt on the guilt of at least 2 victims. When I secure more facts, I shall write again. No one questions my interest in the questions I inquire about. I am taken for granted. Well, Dan, how did you like those damned Yanks is their first query. Sincerely, Dan Kelly.
While they chatted, Grandfather King gazed at his only portrait of Eula. He then, surprisingly, proceeded to tell a very different story about why Eula had been murdered, and by whom. The story that Grandfather King told Dan Kelly was about a white family named Prowl that lived on a farm adjoining the King property that Eula rode past every day coming home from school. Relations between the two families was strained because of a quarrel that happened 2 years before. The quarrel was over a cattle deal. 2 of the Prowls jumped one of King's sons and cut him with a knife, maiming him for life. Tom Prowl, the family patriarch, was livid. He swore revenge. He wanted to make John King hurt where it hurts most. So when Eula came up missing, King immediately suspected the Prowl family was involved. Grandfather King's suspicions were not just his own. Sheriff Mayo noticed 3 sets of footprints had been left at Eula's murder scene, and they led to an abandoned house owned by the Prowl family. Inside, the sheriff found and arrested brothers Claude and Audie Prowl. He brought them to the Fairfield jail where they spent the night. They were still in the jail when the white mob broke in and carried the 3 black men back to Kirvin, and ultimately a fiery death. The Prowl brothers claimed that the reason their footprints were in the area where Eula was killed was because they had been making moonshine nearby. However, by the time anyone could investigate this claim, the 3 black men had been killed and the community had closed ranks around the story that they, and only they, had been Eula's murderers. Sheriff Mayo quietly released the Prowl brothers and told them to never set foot in the county again. The Prowl brothers did just that. In fact, Even though Patriarch Tom Prowl had spent his entire life in Kirvin, he up and moved the entire family to Oklahoma within days of the murder. By mid-July of 1922, a mere 6 weeks after Eula's murder, the Prowls were so far removed from Kirvin that Audie Prowl and his younger sister Lila were featured in their new church program as scripture readers. While the Prowls were settling into their new lives as Oklahomans, Freestone County was still reeling from what came to be known as the Troubles. Suspicion of the Prowl brothers was not a secret. They were arrested by Sheriff Mayo before the 3 black men were captured. Although early reporting was spotty and somewhat inaccurate, mention of 2 white men being involved was included in the earliest reporting from newspapers starting on the day after the murder. By the next day, May the 6th, the Prowl brothers were being named as suspects in many newspapers. Due to a mistake by the Associated Press, their name was misspelled as Crowell instead of Powell. This simple error may have allowed for them to go undetected for many years in the future. In all, Claude and Audie were mentioned in 45 different newspapers around the country, but only 2 in Texas, in the cities of Port Arthur and Taylor. The story did not run in any newspaper in the area where anyone would have known who the Prowl family was. Eula's story was the 1920s version of going viral. Her name had over 1,000 mentions in newspapers. The story ran in almost all the states and was carried as far away as Australia and Canada. Many papers ran multiple follow-up stories. For a few weeks, Freestone County was the center of the universe, in a very bad way. Horace Mayo, who had only recently won his first ever election, constantly found himself the center of attention. He did not always handle it well. His story changed, and he distributed justice unevenly. He stood up to the Ku Klux Klan, who were seizing the opportunity to make their presence known, but caved in to a narrative that he secretly felt was not true. At times, the moment seemed to be too big for him, and the community noticed. Horace Mayo was the sheriff of Freestone County for only 1 term, but it was 2 years of hell. Even before Eula's murder and its aftermath, the battle with moonshiners and bootleggers caused the governor to declare martial law in the county. Amidst it all, the choir singing, church-going, family-loving Mayo killed at least 2 men, and maybe a third. One of the men killed by Mayo, according to people living near Kirvin at the time, happened when white men were killing every black man they found in the weeks following the Troubles. Supposedly, Sheriff Mayo drove up as a black man was being hanged by an angry white mob. Having already failed to protect black men from other white mobs, Mayo took a different approach. As the unfortunate man was dangling from a noose, strangling, the sheriff took out his pistol and shot the man.
Horace Mayo killed the guy when they were just killing everyone they could find. Here in Fairfield, Feds drove up on the old Fairfield Road, and there was one hanging from a tree. Might have been a week or 2, I don't know. The Feds said that when they was hanging this nigger between the street, that he just drove up and got out and shot the guy, killed him. Didn't go through the punishment they was putting him through. I think they tried to put every black guy they could catch through the same problem she went through.
On June 1st, 1922, a young man named Leroy Gibson went to Kirvin to visit his girlfriend. He was the son of Ben Gibson, who worked for Grandfather King, and who was the first man sent to look for Eula on May 4th. Leroy may have believed his connection to the King family afforded him protection from the white anger still simmering in the community. It did not. He was arrested. Leroy resisted, broke free, and made a run for it. Shots were fired, and he was hit in the leg, but he kept running, or limping, away toward the community of Simsboro 9 miles away. Simsboro was populated by several black families who attended the Mount Pleasant Church there. The community was so isolated, with no electricity or telephones, that its inhabitants were unaware of the murder and lynchings that had occurred weeks earlier in Kirvin.
That was the house to which Allie Gibson walked from Kirvin after he had been shot in the leg. It's about 9 miles. And he walked all this distance, spent the night with his grandparents, and the next day, a group of white men, at least 7 of them, and maybe more, came, having chased or tracked Allie from Kirvin. And the house behind us is where Lutetia Gibson lived as a young girl. And I interviewed her at that same site in the 1990s. And she recalled seeing white men coming across the field, seeing the sun glinting off their rifles, and going up to the Gibson house, bringing Allie out, laying him down on the ground somewhere in this area, and shooting him into doll racks. His, I believe it would have been his uncle, Leroy, then ran out of the house with a rifle, and one of the white mob shot and killed him as well. After which Floyd Gibson, another uncle to Allie, who was a World War I veteran, came out, picked up the rifle that Leroy had dropped, laid down on the ground, and began shooting the white men as they fled. Killed two of them. Actually, one of them died en route to the hospital. The other one died in the hospital.
Allie was shot in the yard of the house. The house had a barbed wire fence around and had a gate. And when Allie came out of that gate, that man shot him. So Leroy was shot down behind the house in the field. They took him out in the field. We were in there at the house. We was out in the yard.
Okay.
We wasn't working that day. I was 13. I was a good size. We just didn't know what was going on. And we just stood there and looked. He was standing on the back porch behind his mother. His mother had just stopped begging him. This same man, imagine, please don't shoot my son, please don't shoot my son. Well, she talked him off and he left. And they thought everybody was gone. And my brother Aaron took his rifle and he said, I'm going down to see about mama now. It's his grandmother. And that's when they shot him down. They had killed Leroy and my brother was shooting. We could see them running.
According to a statement issued by Freestone County officials, they were ambushed after they came to the Gibson house. These officials claim Leroy Gibson had confessed to participating in the assault and murder of Eula Ausley before he was killed. The confession was highly suspect. Wild rumors circulated throughout that night through 3 Texas counties and were responsible for the more than 2,000 heavily armed white men who came to Simsboro and Kirvin the next day. Police Chief Sam Allen of Mayo came to Simsboro with 4 automobiles loaded with deputized citizens and regular officers. Mayo Mayor J.I. Riddle had arranged with local hardware stores to furnish guns and ammunition to whites. The exact number of whites and Negroes involved in what was termed by officers as an uprising could not be determined, although it was reported to be a good many. By this point, many blacks of Freestone County had gathered at the Gibson house. After a month of violent attacks, they decided it was time to take a stand. They were also heavily armed and were preparing for an attack. They lined both sides of the one road that goes through Simsboro, hiding behind bushes and trees. It was shaping up to be an extremely brutal and deadly event. When tensions reached their peak, a strange trio of men, Sheriff Mayo, Texas Ranger Manny Gonzalez, and prominent farmer, Carter Sessions, arrived at the scene. Gonzalez was a notable Texas Ranger, known for his strict law enforcement and significant contributions to public safety in Texas. He joined the Texas Rangers in 1920 and later became famous for his work in taming lawless oil boom towns during the Great Depression. Gonzalez was known for his fearless approach. Records show that more well-known Texas Rangers like Frank Hamer had come earlier in the saga to keep the peace, but this time Gonzalez came alone, which was befitting of his nickname, the Lone Wolf. Gonzalez and Hamer reached their pinnacle of fame a decade later when they gunned down famous bank robbers Bonnie and Clyde. This episode was chronicled in the 2022 film, The Highwayman. At the general store, Carter Sessions, known well in the community as a prominent farmer and an original pioneer in Freestone County, took the lead in talking to the white mob. He was overheard saying, 90% of Kirvin wants the Rangers to come here and settle this mess. It's an outrage and a nuisance. I am not defending the Negroes. The murder of the Ausley girl was an atrocious crime, and the burning of the 3 Negroes was just, but it should stop now. If a white man had been accidentally killed here last night, 50 Negroes would have been exterminated. Gonzalez was also successful talking to the blacks lining the road. No one knows for sure exactly what he said, but he talked them into going back towards the Gibson home and assured them that no harm would come to them. Gonzalez then went into Kirvin and shut down all the bars for the evening. Even though the blacks did retreat, they didn't fully believe Gonzalez. The next day Sessions went into the black community. He later said that, "I went there to make an investigation of the whole affair. No one was in sight and I shouted that I was a federal agent. Negro men, women, and children came creeping out of the brush and on their knees and with tears in their eyes."
Of course, most of the colored people left there, Steve. After this all happened, as many of them were killed, they just drifted away. So that's one thing that brought Kirvin down.
After that harrowing night in Simsboro, the blacks had had enough. After a full month of lynchings, violence, intimidations, and relationships strained beyond repair with their white neighbors, most decided it was time to go. Very quietly and with very little fanfare, they packed up their meager belongings and left the area, never to return. A meeting of the town fathers occurred in an attempt to end the violence once and for all, but it was too late. The vast majority of black families were gone, and there was no way to get them back. Suddenly, a realization came over all that remained. Harvest season was less than 1 month away, and the majority of their workforce had just left town. But even before this new reality could set in, this little Texas town would be cast into the national spotlight one more time.